It started with a tiara. Not a metaphor. Not a headline. An actual tiara sitting slightly wrong on Queen Camilla's head, and, somehow, that small thing set off a chain of events that nobody at the palace saw coming. Not the aides. Not the photographers lined up behind the velvet rope. Not even the royal protection officers who are paid specifically to see everything coming. I was there. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I was standing maybe 30 feet from the main entrance to the venue, St. James's Palace, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, and I watched the whole thing unfold the way you watch a car slowly rolling toward a curb. You keep thinking someone's going to stop it. And, then, they don't. Let me back up. The setup the morning had started the way most London mornings do in November, grey and cold and smelling faintly of rain that hadn't quite decided to fall yet. The sky was that flat pewter color that makes everything look slightly underdeveloped, like a photograph taken before the colors came in. I'd been in the city for 4 days at that point, visiting a friend who lives near Victoria, and she'd managed to get us access to a public-facing royal engagement through her work, something to do with a charitable foundation connected to the palace. We weren't guests exactly. More like approved onlookers. We had lanyards. Lanyards that meant absolutely nothing, as it turned out, but they made us feel like we belonged. The event was a formal reception marking some anniversary of a Commonwealth cultural initiative. The kind of event that gets 3 inches in the broadsheet newspapers and a small video clip online, if anything at all. Dignified. Low-key by royal standards. Which meant there were still maybe 200 people gathered in and around the courtyard, plus a row of press photographers behind their designated barrier, plus security personnel positioned at intervals that looked casual but definitely weren't. My friend, I'll call her Rose because that's actually her name, and she said I could have done this sort of thing before. She knew which side to stand on, which moments to expect, how to read the energy of a crowd like this. She'd told me on the walkover that these engagements usually run with the precision of a military operation. Watch the aides, she'd said, pulling her coat tighter. They know everything 30 seconds before it happens. Their faces tell you. I'd filed that away without really understanding it yet. The forecourt was already populated when we arrived, small clusters of guests in dark coats and formal dress, the occasional flash of a military medal or a silk scarf in jewel tones. There were barriers arranged to create a loose path from the main entrance toward the reception area inside. Flowers, white and cream chrysanthemums, in arrangements near the doors. A small string quartet had been playing somewhere inside, and the music drifted out in fragments every time a door opened. The King's Guard was posted at the gate. That's always the first thing you notice. Those soldiers in their bearskin hats, standing absolutely motionless in a way that looks inhuman because it essentially is. You forget sometimes that there's an actual person inside all that ceremonial armor. A living, breathing, thinking human being who's been trained to look exactly like he isn't one. There were 2 of them at the primary entrance that morning. I noticed them the way you notice furniture, present, noted, filed away. That was my first mistake. The arrival of the cars came at 10:47. I know the exact time because Rose had her phone out. Not to photograph, she was checking a message, and I glanced at the screen when the first black vehicle rounded the corner. 10:47 a.m. There were 3 vehicles in the convoy. Standard configuration, apparently lead car, principal car, follow car. They moved slowly, the way official vehicles always do, with that deliberate unhurried pace that somehow communicates importance more than speed ever could. The crowd, and I use that word loosely, it was more of a politely assembled gathering, shifted and oriented itself toward the entrance. That ripple of attention you get when something is about to happen. People straightening. Cameras being raised. A low murmur replacing the quiet. The principal car stopped. A protection officer stepped out from the front passenger side first, moving to the rear door with practiced efficiency. And, then, Queen Camilla stepped out. She was wearing a deep blue coat, the color of midnight if midnight had been dry-cleaned and tailored by someone who really knew what they were doing, with a cream-colored brooch at the lapel. And, the tiara. A formal piece, not the largest in the royal collection by any measure, but significant enough that it caught the thin November light and threw it back in small, fractured gleams. She looked well. Composed. That particular brand of composed that comes from decades of practice, not stiff, but settled. Like someone who has learned to make stillness look like a choice. The applause started immediately. Measured, respectful. Not the frenzied kind you get at pop concerts or football matches. Palace applause has its own register, warm but contained, like tea that's cooled to exactly the right temperature. She smiled. Turned slightly to acknowledge the crowd on both sides. Her senior aide, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the expression of someone perpetually calculating 17 things at once, moved 2 steps behind her. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then, I noticed it. And I genuinely think I noticed it before most people in that courtyard did. Maybe because I was at the right angle. Maybe because the light caught it differently from where I was standing. The tiara. It was, and I'm trying to find the right word here, listing. Just slightly. Not dramatically. If you'd glanced and looked away, you'd have missed it. But if you kept watching, the way I happened to be watching because I had nothing more important to do, you could see that it had shifted on her head. Just a centimeter or two, maybe, toward the left. Enough that it no longer sat in that perfect centered position. Enough that if she moved a certain way, if she leaned forward or turned quickly, it might slip further. Camilla hadn't noticed. Or if she had, she wasn't showing it. She was greeting the first line of guests now, moving along the informal receiving arrangement with the ease of someone who has done this particular thing 10,000 times and made peace with it. Her aide had noticed. I could tell, because I remembered what Rose had said about watching the aides' faces. The silver-haired woman's expression had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but wasn't quite. A small tightening around the eyes. A slight adjustment in her posture, leaning fractionally forward as though she was about to say something, then pulling back because the moment wasn't right. She was waiting for a gap. I nudged Rose. Is the tiara supposed to sit like that? Rose looked harder. No, she said quietly. No, it isn't. The first strange thing, here's something they don't tell you about royal engagements in the tourist brochures or the protocol guides, there's a choreography to them that's almost invisible. Every movement, every transition, every position has been worked out in advance. Who stands where? Who speaks when? How the flow of the event moves from outside to inside, from formal to less formal, from public-facing to private. And, within that choreography, there are unwritten rules about intervention. If something goes wrong, if an aide needs to correct something, adjust something, whisper something, it has to happen in a specific way. At a specific moment. You don't just walk up to a queen in front of 200 people and say, "Excuse me, your tiara is crooked." You wait. You navigate. You find the seam in the schedule where you can step in without disrupting the fabric of the occasion. The silver-haired aide was doing this calculation in real time. I could see it, now that I was watching for it. But something was slowing her down. Someone was in the way. There was a guest, a man, late 60s, broad-shouldered, wearing a military decoration that I didn't know how to read but which clearly meant something, who had positioned himself in the line at exactly the wrong spot. He was speaking to Camilla with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting a long time to say a specific thing, and he was not going to rush it. He was leaning slightly forward, gesturing with both hands. His wife or companion, a woman in a rose-colored dress, stood slightly behind him with the patient expression of someone who has watched this behavior at every formal function for 40 years. The aide couldn't get past him. Or rather, she could have physically gotten past him, but to do so would have created a visible disruption, a cutting across the natural flow that would have drawn exactly the kind of attention nobody wanted. So she waited. And the tiara waited with her, sitting at its slight angle, neither better nor worse, held in place by what I can only assume were a significant number of hairpins and a certain amount of institutional dignity. The man in the military decoration finished speaking. Camilla responded warmly. I could see the warmth from where I stood, and then he stepped back, satisfied, and the flow resumed. The aide moved forward. And that's when the guard stepped in. The guard, I didn't see him move. That's the thing. One moment he was simply there, at his post, motionless, a piece of ceremonial architecture, and then, between 1 second and the next he was different. Not dramatically. Not with any lunge or shout or visible alarm. Just present in a way he hadn't been before. Later, thinking about it, I realized I hadn't seen him because I didn't know what to look for. I was watching the aide, watching Camilla, watching the Tiara. The guard was peripheral to me. He was in that zone of things you see without registering. But Rose saw it. She grabbed my arm. "Something's happening," she said. And her voice had changed, that particular frequency shift that means what someone is telling you is real. The guard had stepped, and, I want to be precise, not in front of Camilla. Not at her. He'd stepped toward the aide. One deliberate step, and then, he'd raised his arm, not dramatically, not like he was stopping traffic, but a firm, extended positioning of his arm that created an unmistakable barrier between the aide and the path to Camilla. The aide stopped. She looked at the guard. He was facing forward, the way they always face, that fixed gaze that looks past everything at some middle distance nobody else can see. But his arm was there. His presence was there. A wall made of protocol and training and something else that I couldn't name yet. What is he doing? I heard someone near me say. A woman's voice. Confused, not alarmed. That was the question. That was the question everyone in the near vicinity was now quietly asking, because even in a gathering of people trained to observe royal etiquette with discretion, this was unusual enough to register. The aide was standing still. The guard's arm was extended. And Queen Camilla was continuing along the line, unaware, the tiara still listing slightly to the left, the November light catching it at intervals. No one moved. For what felt like a very long moment, no one moved at all. The silence lasted maybe 8 seconds. I counted. Not deliberately, it's just what my brain did, the way it does when something feels wrong and time slows down and you start keeping track of things automatically, like a witness preparing testimony you didn't know you'd need to give. 8 seconds where the aide stood behind the guard's extended arm. 8 seconds where the murmuring in the crowd dropped to almost nothing. 8 seconds where the string quartet music drifted out through the palace doors and the chrysanthemums sat in their arrangements and the world held very still. And then, Princess Anne arrived. She was already there. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I replay it in my head. And was already in the courtyard. She'd been there before the cars arrived, which I learned later was intentional. She'd been greeting some of the charity representatives inside and had come out through a side entrance a few minutes before the convoy pulled up. She was standing maybe 20 feet to the left of the main entrance, speaking with a small group of guests, dressed in a dark green coat with gold buttons that made her look, there's no other way to put it, like someone who was born to stand in courtyards and know exactly what to do in them. She wasn't watching the Camilla situation directly. But she was aware of it. That much became clear very quickly. I think she'd been watching it peripherally for longer than any of us realized. Because when the guard blocked the aide, when that quiet standoff began and didn't need any preparation, she didn't visibly react. She simply excused herself from the conversation she was in, a small nod, a brief touch on the arm of the person she'd been speaking with, and moved. Not quickly. Not with any obvious urgency. She moved the way she always moves, which is to say with absolute certainty and without a single wasted motion. She crossed the distance in maybe 12 or 13 paces and positioned herself at a point that put her slightly behind and to the right of Camilla, which put her also, critically, on the other side of the guard from the aide. She came around. She simply came around the whole situation, as if she'd already mapped it in her head and identified the one angle that worked. I turned to Rose. "Did you?" "Yes," Rose said. She was completely still. One of those moments when a person becomes very focused in a way that's quiet and absolute. What and did she leaned in? That's what I saw. Princess Anne leaned toward Queen Camilla in a way that looked, to an uninformed observer, like simple familial proximity. Like a sister-in-law making a quiet observation. The kind of thing that happens at events like this all the time, a word passed, a gentle comment, a private moment in a public space. Camilla's head turned slightly. I watched her listen. And then, something happened in Camilla's expression. Not embarrassment, nothing so unguarded as that. But, a shift. A microscopic recalibration. She raised one hand, briefly, just to her hairline, and then thought better of it and lowered it. And said something else. This time Camilla smiled. Not the formal event smile, this was different. Smaller. More genuine. The smile of someone who is in a mildly mortifying situation and has decided, with the help of someone they trust, that it's survivable. They moved together naturally, as if it had been planned, as if this was simply part of how the morning was structured, toward the entrance to the building. The transition was clean. The greeting line had been nearly completed anyway. The remainder of the outdoor reception flowed into an interior greeting with an ease that made it look seamless. Inside, away from 200 pairs of eyes and a row of cameras, the Tiara could be properly attended to. That was the plan and executed in approximately 90 seconds. The guard, but I hadn't forgotten about him. And here's the part that stayed with me more than any of the rest of it, honestly. Because the question I kept asking myself and that I heard other people around me beginning to ask under their breath was why? Why had he blocked the aid? That was the part that didn't fit the pattern, that didn't slot neatly into the ceremonial choreography I'd been watching. Rose had a theory. She's the kind of person who has theories about most things, and she's usually at least partially right. Something triggered him, she said. We were standing close together now, keeping our voices down. These guards don't just act. There's protocol. Something made him see a threat where you or I would see a normal situation. The aid wasn't a threat, I said. No. But maybe something about the approach looked off. The angle. The speed. Something the guard's training flagged. I thought about that. He made a mistake, then. Rose was quiet for a moment. Or he didn't, she said. We don't actually know what he saw that we didn't. That's the thing about soldiers who've been trained to this level of attention. Their perception is calibrated differently. What reads as normal to you and me, an aide moving toward a royal with purpose and some urgency, might read differently through a framework of threat assessment. Not every instinct that fires is right. But not every instinct that fires is wrong, either. Later, one of the people from the charitable organization who'd been near the gate confirmed something quietly to a small group of us, that in the moments just before the guard moved, a camera had been raised from the press section in a way that he'd apparently clocked as unexpected. Not aggressive. Not obviously wrong. But outside of the pattern he was tracking. And, in that moment, the aide's movement toward Camilla had coincided with this anomaly, and his training had simply responded. A false positive, maybe. A misread. Or, as Rose kept saying, maybe not entirely. The camera in question, it turned out, belonged to a press photographer who'd been adjusting his lens and raised it at an odd angle because he'd been trying to capture the tiara itself. He'd noticed the listing too, before most of us, and he'd been maneuvering for the shot. A photographer trying to document a crooked tiara had triggered a protection response that had briefly locked down an aide's access and created one of the stranger moments I've witnessed in a public setting. This is how life actually works, I think. Not in clean lines. In overlapping accidents. The courtyard, after once Camilla and had moved inside, the energy of the courtyard shifted in that specific way that happens when the main event has passed. People relaxed slightly. The hum of conversation resumed. A few guests drifted toward the entrance to follow. The photographers behind the barrier began lowering their cameras and murmuring to each other. I stayed put. I wanted to watch the guard. He'd return to his post. Back to motionless. Back to that practiced stillness that looks carved. His arm was at his side. His face was front-facing, fixed, revealing nothing. But, here's the thing, and this is what I've thought about most since then, lying awake thinking about it the way you do with scenes that won't quite release you. He knew what had just happened. He was inside that uniform, behind that face, and he knew that he'd interrupted an aide's access to the Queen. He knew that it had played out in front of 200 people. He knew that Princess Anne had stepped in and resolved a situation that had partly been created by his own instinct. He knew all of that. And he stood there anyway, exactly as he had before. There's something in that. Something that takes a particular kind of discipline I don't think I could sustain. You stand. You hold. You don't explain yourself because that's not the job. The job is presence. The job is posture. The job is being that thing, that unmoved, unreadable thing, regardless of whatever is happening inside you. I found it almost unbearable to watch. And, also, strangely, beautiful. Rose appeared at my elbow with 2 cups of tea from a table that had been set up near the side of the courtyard. She pressed one into my hands. You're staring at the guard, she said. I know. You've been staring at him for 5 minutes. Probably. She looked at him too for a moment. They train for years, she said quietly. To be like that. To hold like that. I know. Still gets you, doesn't it? Yeah, I said. Yeah, it does. What the crowd said there was a woman nearby. I'd noticed her earlier because she had a particular presence, the kind of person who stands in a way that takes up slightly more space than their physical body, in the best possible sense. She had her husband next to her and a program from the event in her gloved hands. She turned to the couple on her other side. Did you see that? She said. Not whispering, she'd decided, it seemed, that what had happened was real enough to be spoken about. The guard, the other woman said. He blocked her. The aide. He actually just put his arm out. I saw, the other woman said. And, then, Princess and yes. A pause. The husband said something I didn't catch. His wife shook her head. It wasn't his fault, she said. You could see he wasn't sure. He was responding to something. But, the aide just wanted to fix the tiara, the first woman said. He didn't know that. He should have known that. That's literally his job. His job, the other woman said carefully, is to not let anyone he hasn't cleared approach the queen at speed without knowing why. He was doing his job. She was doing her job. She paused, looking for the word. Collided, her husband supplied. Yes, she said. They collided. I thought that was exactly right. I've thought so ever since. 2 people doing exactly what they were supposed to do, following exactly the procedures they'd been given, and still ending up on opposite sides of an extended arm in front of 200 strangers. No villain. No hero. Just systems meeting at an unexpected intersection. Except that isn't entirely right either. Because Anne was a hero in that moment. Not dramatically. Not with a speech or a confrontation or a raised voice. She was a hero the way competent people often are, quietly, officially, with no fanfare and no waiting for recognition. She saw a problem. She had the standing and the knowledge and the composure to fix it. And she moved. The wait the next 20 minutes were uneventful in the way that only feels possible after something eventful, that flatness you get when adrenaline drains out of a crowd and everyone is left standing in a courtyard holding tea and trying to recalibrate. We learned through the organization's liaison, a young man in a navy suit who was very earnest and very stressed and kept touching his earpiece, that the reception inside was proceeding normally. That Camilla was well. That the schedule was on track. He said none of this about the tiara, obviously. That wasn't a conversation anyone was going to have out loud. But, you could infer it. You could feel the collective exhale of the event settling back into its intended shape. Rose found a spot near one of the flower arrangements and I stood with her, warming my hands on the tea, watching the courtyard return to its prior mood. Watching guests talk and photographers pack equipment and a small child in a red coat run briefly toward the barrier before being retrieved by a parent who looked like they wanted to disappear into the flagstones. Normal life, doing its normal things. And, at the gate, the 2 guards standing exactly as they'd been standing when I arrived. Do you think he'll hear about it later? I asked Rose. The guard. Do you think someone will talk to him? Almost certainly, she said. These things get reviewed. And, what do you think happens to him? She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. Honestly? I think they'll see what he saw and understand why he responded. I think they'll acknowledge he was working with incomplete information. And I think they'll thank him for taking the situation seriously, even if the situation turned out to be, she searched for the word. A crooked tiara, I offered. She laughed. A small, genuine laugh. Even if it was that. A detail I missed. Here's something I didn't realize until much later, when I was back at Rose's flat and we were debriefing over dinner. She'd been watching the aide during all of this, not the guard, not Camilla, but the aide, and she'd noticed something I'd completely missed. When the guard's arm went up and the aide stopped, the aide hadn't looked alarmed. She hadn't looked offended. She hadn't done any of the things you might expect from a senior palace official who'd just been physically blocked from approaching the queen. She'd waited. That's it. She'd simply waited. She knew something would resolve it, Rose said. She trusted the structure. She trusted that whatever was happening with the guard was happening for a reason, even if she didn't know the reason yet. And she waited for the situation to work itself out. That hit me harder than I expected. Because the easy narrative, the one my brain had been reaching for since the moment the arm went up, was the dramatic one. The conflict one. Guard overreaches. Aid is obstructed. Princess steps in. Resolution. But the aide's stillness complicated that. Her quiet trust in the system, even when the system was momentarily blocking her, suggested something more textured. That she'd been in enough situations to know that panic makes things worse. That sometimes the right move is to hold, to let the other pieces of the structure do what they're designed to do. She trusted and to see it. And did. How many people in that courtyard do you think knew all of that was happening? I asked Rose. She thought about it. Properly understood it? As it was happening? Yeah. Maybe 6, she said. Maybe 8. Out of 200. Out of 200. I sat with that for a while. The rest of the world saw a smooth, dignified royal engagement. A queen greeted guests. A princess was present. The schedule was kept. And, somewhere in the middle of all of it, a tiara listed to the left and a guard raised his arm and an aide stood very still and a woman in a green coat with gold buttons made 12 paces look like competence made visible. And, almost no one knew, there are moments in life that don't announce themselves as important while they're happening. You're just standing there. Holding your tea. Watching the chrysanthemums not move in the windless November air. And something passes through the space in front of you and your brain files it quietly, without ceremony, in whatever folder it uses for things that will turn out to matter later. This was one of those. I didn't know it yet when we finally moved inside, following the last few remaining guests through the main doors of St. James's Palace. I didn't know it over the course of the next hour, during which the reception proceeded with the kind of stately normalcy that makes you feel like nothing unusual had ever happened anywhere on Earth. I didn't know it that evening, or really even the next day. I think I started to understand it about a week later, when I was back home, back in my ordinary life, and I found myself at a work meeting watching a colleague try to reach a manager who'd been briefly intercepted by someone else's agenda, and I thought, this is what that was. This is the shape of that. Systems crossing. People caught between parallel duties. And someone seeing it from a distance and making the quiet decision to walk 12 paces and fix it. That's when I knew I was going to write it down. Inside the palace St. James's isn't Buckingham. People often forget that. It has a different quality, older, closer, less theatrical in its scale. The ceilings feel lower. The light comes from different angles. There's a warmth to the stone that Buckingham's grandeur tends to flatten. Walking in felt like stepping into something that had absorbed 300 years of precise occasion and still remembered all of it. The interior reception was held in a room I'm not going to attempt to describe architecturally because I don't have the vocabulary. Largely formal, with paneling that went all the way to the ceiling and portraits in oils that watched you with the specific patience of people who have been hanging in the same spot for a very long time. Long tables with white cloth covers. More flowers, this time arranged in low centerpieces that wouldn't obstruct sightlines. Which I now understood was a deliberate choice. Everything in a space like that is a deliberate choice. Queen Camilla was already inside when we entered. She was standing in a loose group near the far end of the room, speaking with guests with the ease of someone who had made a brief adjustment and moved on. The tiara was straight. Perfectly centered. Whatever had happened in the moments after she and went inside, it had been handled and it was done, and she had returned to the surface of the event as if she'd never left it. You would not have known. If you'd walked in right then, fresh, with no knowledge of what had happened in the courtyard 20 minutes earlier, you would have seen only this: a queen in a midnight blue coat, a room of formally dressed guests, a reception proceeding on schedule. That's what the institution is designed to produce. Continuity. Composure. The impression that nothing is ever quite as disrupted as it might have been. I'll say this, watching it from the inside, having seen what I'd seen, it wasn't cynical. It wasn't hollow. There was something genuinely impressive about a structure that could absorb a complication and redistribute it so completely that the surface showed no trace. Like watching water close over a stone. Finding an eye-spotted princess and roughly 15 minutes into the interior reception. She was standing near one of the windows with a small group, 3 people, maybe 4, and she was laughing. Not performing laughter. Actually laughing. Her head tilted back very slightly and something genuine crossing her face, the kind of thing that doesn't photograph the way it looks in person. She was holding a cup. I think it was coffee, not tea. Something darker. I watched her for a moment and tried to map what I'd seen outside onto the woman standing at the window, and there was a part of me that kept wanting to make the story bigger. Wanting to reach for drama, the princess who seized control, who intervened, who took command. Because that's what titles do to moments. They inflate them. They make them sound like a confrontation when what actually happened was something much quieter and much more human. She'd seen a problem. She'd walked over. She'd said something that made Camilla smile. She'd moved them inside. That was it. That was the whole of it. And, standing in that room, watching her laugh at something someone had just said, I thought, the magnitude of a thing isn't always visible from the outside. The 12 paces and took across that courtyard mattered enormously and looked like almost nothing. The guard's arm, extended for maybe 8 seconds, had sent a ripple through the whole choreography of the morning. The aide's stillness, her choice to trust and wait rather than push, had been the hinge that everything else turned on. None of it would appear in the official photographs. None of it would make the 3-inch newspaper story. The record of this morning would show a smooth engagement, dignitaries met, charitable purpose honored. And, somewhere in that gap, between what was recorded and what actually happened, was the whole living truth of it. The photographer, I found him near the press barrier, packing his equipment. He was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the efficient movements of someone who does physical tasks by muscle memory, barely thinking about them anymore. Camera bodies going into cases with practiced clicks. Lenses wrapped and slotted. I approached carefully. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to speak to the press photographers. I genuinely didn't know the protocol, but nobody stopped me, and he looked up with the mild, unthreatened expression of someone who spent decades at public events and has evaluated strangers on sight many more times than most people could count. Were you trying to photograph the tiara? I asked. Directly. I figured directness was the best approach, given the circumstances. He paused in his packing. Looked at me. What tiara? Which told me everything, actually. Because if he'd been trying to photograph it, he knew exactly what I meant. And his instinct was to say what tiara, which meant he knew it was a sensitive item and wasn't sure yet whether I was someone he wanted to confirm things to. I hesitated. The slight positioning issue with Her Majesty's tiara. He studied me for another moment. Then, something in his posture relaxed very slightly. I noticed it, he said. Yes. I was angling for a clearer shot because the light at that angle was interesting. I wasn't trying to make it into anything. The guard saw you move and, I know, he said. I figured that out afterwards. He zipped one of his bags with a firm, final sound. That's the job, isn't it? They see everything. They're not supposed to wait around to find out if it's innocent. Does that bother you? He considered. It bothered me for about 45 seconds, he said. Then, I got over it. A pause. Did you get a shot? I'm not press, I said. Ah. He picked up his equipment. Then, no. You didn't get a shot. And, he moved away without unfriendliness, heading toward the exit, and I stood in the pale interior light and thought about what he'd said. They're not supposed to wait around to find out if it's innocent. Rose, after we left the reception around noon. The event wound down in the way these things do, a gradual thinning of the room, guests beginning to drift, the white tablecloth starting to show the slight disarray of an occasion that had been attended and was now concluding. Outside, the courtyard was quieter. The guards were still at their posts. Different ones. I thought a rotation must have happened, but, wearing the same stillness, the same bearskin hats, the same practiced distance from the living world. Rose and I walked toward the gate in comfortable silence for a moment. That was one of the more unusual things I've seen at one of these, she said finally. High bar, I said. Medium bar, actually. These events are sometimes surprisingly eventful. She paused to put on her gloves, her breath making small clouds in the November air. What struck me most was that nobody panicked. Not the aide. Not the guard, really. Not Anne. Nobody made it worse. The guard made it more complicated, I offered. Complicated isn't worse, she said. Panic is worse. Overreaction is worse. Everyone in that situation held their nerve and did the next right thing. I thought about that. Even the guard? Especially the guard, she said. He made a call on incomplete information. That's all any of us can do, ever, in any situation. He made a call. It wasn't quite the right call. But, it was made from the right place. She looked back at the gate as we passed through it. I hope they tell him that, whoever debriefs him. I hope they make sure he knows that. I hoped so too. I still do. What the day taught me, there's a version of this story where the guard is the villain. Overzealous, overcautious, inserting himself where he didn't belong and disrupting the smooth functioning of an important occasion. There's a version where he's the hero, a soldier operating on pure training and professional discipline, protecting the queen from a perceived anomaly and standing firm when it would have been easier to stand down. Neither of those is quite right. What he was present. Radically, completely present. More present than almost anyone else in that courtyard. Watching, processing, responding. Not perfectly, but honestly. Without self-interest. Without any motive beyond the one he'd been given, keep the person in the blue coat safe. Make sure nothing unexpected comes at her without you knowing why. That kind of presence is rarer than we talk about. Most of us move through our days at a significant remove from what's actually happening around us. We're thinking ahead or looking back, planning the next thing or rehashing the last. We're only partially there. He was entirely there. And, Princess, and she was entirely there too. In a different way. Not fixed and watchful, but mobile and perceptive. Reading the room the way experienced people read rooms, not one face at a time but the whole of it, all at once, in her peripheral vision while she was doing something else. She saw the problem because she'd never stopped seeing the room. She fixed it because she had the position and the knowledge and the relationship to do what the aide, in that particular moment, couldn't. And the aide. Standing still. Trusting. 3 different kinds of competence. 3 different ways of being present. Colliding briefly in a courtyard on a Tuesday morning in November, producing a scene that lasted maybe 90 seconds and which most of the 200 people attending didn't fully register. And a tiara, sitting slightly crooked in the November light, waiting to be fixed. That evening Rose made dinner. Pasta, from memory, with a lot of garlic and a bottle of red wine that was probably slightly too good for a Tuesday. We sat at her kitchen table and talked about it for a long time, longer than the incident probably warranted, or maybe exactly as long as it warranted. It's hard to calibrate these things. At some point the conversation drifted to other things, the way conversations always do given enough time and wine, and the morning became one layer among others rather than the only thing in the room. But I kept coming back to it. Kept seeing the guard's arm, extended and still. Kept seeing Anne's 12 paces. The ade's quiet waiting. Do you think Camilla knew any of it? I asked at one point. The guard, the photographer, what and had to navigate, do you think she knew any of the mechanics of it? Rose looked into her glass. I think she had a sense, she said. People like that always have a sense. They learn to read the temperature of a room, even when they're the reason the temperature is rising. A pause. But, the details? Probably not. And, that's almost by design. She doesn't need the details. She needs to be able to walk back into the room and continue. Continue, I repeated. That's the job, Rose said. For all of them. That's always the job. Whatever happens, continue. The ending, which is really just the beginning, I went home 2 days later. Train from Paddington, window seat, the western edges of London giving way to countryside with the slow reluctance of a city that always thinks you should stay a little longer. I had my notebook out, I keep a paper one, old habit, and I was writing down what I remembered. The chrysanthemums. The gray sky. The tiara catching the light at its slight, stubborn angle. The arm. The 12 paces. The coffee cup in Anne's hand. The photographer's gray beard. The aide standing still and waiting. The guard, back at his post, carrying everything in silence. I filled about 4 pages before the train moved into a tunnel and the window went dark and I looked at my own reflection for a moment, suspended in the black glass. Here's what I've decided, sitting with all of it, the most important things that happen in any given day almost never look like the most important things that happen. They wear the costume of small moments. A slightly wrong angle. A half-second decision. 12 paces across a courtyard. The choice to wait instead of push. And, the people who hold things together really hold them, in the moments when the invisible seams start to show rarely get the headline. They get the relief. They get the quiet satisfaction of the thing continuing, of the surface remaining smooth, of no one in the room having to see the mechanics. They get to stand at a window with their coffee and laugh at something someone just said, and the rest of the room doesn't know. Can't know. Doesn't need to. The tiara was straight by the time anyone photographed it. The reception continued. The charitable initiative was honored. The official record shows a smooth and dignified morning. And, somewhere in the gap between the record and the reality, a guard stood at his post and carried what he knew in absolute, unbroken silence. That's what discipline looks like, when it isn't performing. It looks like nothing happened at all.